Whilst in flight and for the duration of any stay on the lunar surface, the Apollo astronauts would have been totally at the mercy of unpredictable solar particle events. Solar flares could have affected any moon-bound astronaut at any time. A dose of 170 rem could result in vision impairment with a 20 to 30% probability of death within 60 days. Even a relatively low dose, around 70 rem, could result in vomiting, nausea and diarrhea during the trip. Throwing up into a spacesuit is not something NASA would wish to be broadcast live on TV. There was even the possibility of an astronaut dying on the lunar surface in front of millions of viewers back on Earth. Therefore, sending astronauts to the moon with these risks could be described as playing American solar flare roulette.
With the Naval Research Laboratory, NASA launched the SOLRAD satellite. It too studies the sun's radiation and records the disturbances which can disrupt long-range communications and navigation systems. This computer-type picture shows the sun's disk and inner corona. It was returned by OSO 7, the latest in the orbiting solar observatory series. OSO is trying to determine the direct effects solar flares have on the environment, weather, and communications. Earth is surrounded by the magnetosphere, an enormous teardrop-shaped region formed by the solar wind, a supersonic stream of particles blowing on the Earth's magnetic field. It is in this region that a craft like the small scientific satellite does its job.
Einstein once presumed to speak for God when he joked, "God does not play dice." But some would say playing dice with nature is the game NASA played if the agency did indeed send insufficiently protected astronauts through the Van Allen radiation belts and onwards to the moon. So now let's look at this question of radiation and see if and how it posed a serious threat to the successful outcome of Apollo. What in general terms are the dangers of radiation out in deep space? We're not referring to the heat coming from the sun, but the effect of solar particle events, SPEs, including X-rays and gamma rays, on our spacecraft and an unprotected astronaut travelling beyond the protected environment of his home planet. What actually happens when an astronaut leaves the Earth for the moon? A human being leaving Earth for deep space has to travel through the very thick ringed donut of trapped radiation which permanently encircles our planet. This donut contains within it two specific natural zones of very intense radiation. The whole region is named after Dr. James Van Allen, the scientist who registered this discovery in 1958. The innermost zone of the two Van Allen belts surrounds us only some 272 miles out from the Earth's surface.
Entering the Van Allen radiation belt from below, you would see the radiation levels rising considerably. In fact, they're higher within the belt than they are above it, and much higher than they are below it. And then as you got above the Van Allen radiation belt, the radiation would still be very, very high, but lower than this radiation that's trapped within the belt. So those form a formidable barrier to the passage of manned spacecraft within these belts. This radiation varies year by year. The sun has an 11-year sunspot cycle, and every 11 years it appears to repeat. And so every 11 years there's a peak of sunspot activity, and this is associated with a peak of solar radiation. These peaks have been charted from the 1800s all the way to the present. And one of the recent peaks was in 1958, which is one of the reasons they decided to have the International Geophysical Year, and one of the reasons that Explorer 1 discovered the Van Allen radiation belts and all of this type of phenomena. And since then, the next peak was in 1969 and 1970, right when the Apollo missions were supposed to have flown through them. They couldn't have picked a worse time to try to fly a manned flight through this radiation field.
Dr. James Van Allen had pointed out the necessity to shield the astronaut spacecraft adequately, given that these belts of trapped radiation were dangerous to bioorganisms. Since 1962, the Van Allen belts also possess another zone of even more intense radiation, which was artificially introduced by the American military. We suspect that with Operation Starfish Prime, the exploding of a megaton nuclear bomb 248 miles above Earth, NASA was trying to force a corridor through this natural danger zone, but ended up making matters worse. Astronomer Sir Bernard Lovell stated at the time that the effects of this explosion were cataclysmic, both here on Earth and out in space. The radiation created by this engineered explosion was trapped into a third belt, over 100 times more intense than the two natural belts. By 2002, this artificial zone will still be 25 times worse than the most intense zone of radiation trapped within the natural belts. Had NASA not only failed with Starfish Prime to create a corridor, but also increased the radiation risk to unprotected astronauts?
During their research, Bennett and Percy have found that the depth of these Van Allen belts varies considerably according to the source of reference. Despite the fact that numerous probes and the Apollo missions have allegedly traversed these zones of intense radiation, there's little or no agreement on the depth of these zones. James Van Allen stated that they're at least 64,000 miles deep, whereas NASA claims they're only about 24,000 miles deep. Less depth equals less travel time through this danger zone, and as NASA maintains that the Earth-Moon round trip would involve just about 2 hours in the belts, the agency could, and did, just about avoid the issue of spacecraft shielding by asserting that this was too short a time to be of any real danger to its astronauts.
Such a claim is rather like believing that rain will wet you less if you run through it. In reality, whether you move slowly or quickly through rain, you'll tend to get equally as wet. And so it is with radiation, except that with radiation you cannot dry off and return to the state you were before you were irradiated. Radiation is present throughout deep space and alters everything that it comes into contact with. It becomes a part of any bioorganism. Our research findings suggest that firstly, on a return journey to the Moon or Mars, an astronaut would spend around 4 hours within the trapped radiation of the Van Allen belts. And secondly, that to protect human beings adequately for the duration of such a journey in the late 1960s would require a spacecraft far too heavy for any of Wernher von Braun's rockets to launch.
But we're getting rather ahead of ourselves. We'll come back to von Braun's Saturn V rocket shortly. In an interview with researcher Jim Collier in the late 1990s, Dr. James Van Allen said that he stood by his evaluation of the depth and danger of the belts.
There are cosmic rays in space. You have the radiation flux that you have to deal with out there. We understood that. We monitored the sun very, very carefully. We did not send expeditions to the Moon at times when there was the possibility of a particle event on the sun. We didn't want to subject the astronauts to any radiation that could come flying off the sun from a solar flare or a prominence or an event like that. But we thought it through very carefully, and we planned our way through that.
NASA would have us believe that to send its astronauts through space at the height of solar activity was a matter entirely under its control. But it's impossible, even today, to predict when debilitating solar flares are going to occur. Predicting earthquakes is virtually impossible too. This is the aftermath of the Turkish 1999 quake that came with no warning. And again, the Taiwanese 1999 earthquake.
So if the prediction of solar particle events is impossible, what were the means of protecting a crew when travelling through deep space in an unshielded, thin-walled rocket ship?
You could use propellant, structure, other parts of the craft, the heat shield. You would design it so that you would maximize the amount of material between you and the sun for the flight, but try to avoid carrying any material just for the sake of the shielding. It would serve a dual purpose.
With aluminium shielding, it's accepted that the minimum requirement is a thickness of 10 centimetres all around the craft. Was there any attempt to provide such protection?
No. The walls of the craft were made as thin and light as possible. The Apollo capsule itself was made unusually thin. In fact, they couldn't even initially carry enough air inside to be the equivalent to sea level air pressure. They ran it at reduced pressure in order to be able to make the walls thinner. And then the LEM and other parts of the craft were all made out of very thin material, very flimsy. Almost no protection at all against solar radiation.
So why not try using a solid shield to protect the astronauts from these dangers?
Well, they didn't know how to put a shield like you suggest and still be able to make the weight capability of the Saturn V and carry everything to the moon. I believe that Wernher von Braun's team was basically assigned the task of designing a rocket that theoretically could take men to the moon if everything worked and if there were no substantial solar radiation. But the kind of rocket that they would have had to have in order to take people to the moon, taking into account solar radiation, would have been a much more massive vehicle, and they just decided that this was not something that they needed to deal with. They would just tell everybody that the radiation was okay.
A spherical structure enables a craft to withstand a greater amount of internal pressure. The Soviets knew this simple fact, and the designs for their spacecraft were always spherical. Here's a typical Vostok capsule. Compare this with the American thin-walled CSM design.
If NASA didn't know how to protect astronauts from radiation in deep space, it had not been for the want of trying. During the Manhattan Project and for years afterwards, the American government subjected nearly 250,000 Americans, both military and unwitting civilians, to the effects of radiation. These enforced tests provided data on how solar radiation might affect future astronauts. During the experimental detonations of atomic bombs, American military personnel were ordered to walk towards ground zero, totally unprotected. They were ordered to walk straight into the radiation zone, so that their masters could acquire an extensive information base relating to the injuries and damage caused to human tissue by those in close proximity to this radiation.
The surface of the moon is, of course, above the Van Allen radiation belts, and it's exposed to direct solar radiation. In 1959, they sent a spacecraft that flew past the moon. So that spacecraft could easily have, that one or others that followed it, could easily have contained instruments that showed them how lethal the radiation was. You don't need live animals to prove that something can't live out there. You can just send instruments that will show you that the radiation is beyond what can be withstood by animals or humans.
Solar flares and other storm systems on the sun can create enormous, tremendous surges of radiation. Now that radiation is not only potentially dangerous, it could be lethal to those who are outside our atmosphere, which basically protects us. All right, it can cause problems with radio storms and the aurora and things like that. But with major storms, there is a dramatic threat to those who are outside the Earth's atmosphere. And this would have happened with the Apollo missions. Of course, if there had been a major solar flare during an Apollo mission to the moon, it would have been extremely serious, to say the least.
The versatile IMP, 8th in a series, is exploring interplanetary space and the outer fringes of the Earth's magnetosphere. It also provides warnings of possible solar flare radiation hazards to moon-bound astronauts.
No major incident occurred, but it could have been potentially very, very bad. Very bad. Lethal, in fact.
Remember, solar flares occur all the time. It's the degree of their severity that varies. One of the most severe solar flares ever recorded occurred in August 1972 between Apollo missions 16 and 17. This single flare would have delivered 960 rem of virtually instant death to any inadequately protected astronaut out beyond the Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field. Surely reason enough for the space agency to play safe and adopt the surrogate option, as prediction of these events is a very inexact science indeed. Yet the named astronauts were wandering around on the supposed lunar surface in nothing more than what amounts to a thick linen suit. These pressure suits might have allowed for some micrometeorite protection and possibly maintained an appropriate temperature for the astronaut, but they certainly did not qualify as adequate protection against any unexpected burst of debilitating radiation from an SPE. And as if that were not enough, despite strict medical instructions, in some cases these astronauts neglected to use the protective gold visors to shield their faces. Whether this was whistleblowing or sheer arrogance, it is certainly another example of inconsistency in the record, over and beyond that of image manipulation. Forgetting the astronauts for a moment, what indeed could this solar radiation do to the images? We know, for example, how X-rays can affect film on Earth, and we know how the photographs of the damaged Chernobyl nuclear power station were badly fogged from radiation.
You have an enormous amount of radiation in space, and potentially it affects film, of course, and of course, as you will well know, its prime effect is on contrast.
We took a latent image recorded on the film of a colour test chart and exposed it to 8 MeV X-rays. The lowest radiation dose we applied to the film was 25 rem. The latent image, if it hadn't been subjected to radiation, would look like this: a good quality, high contrast, colour transparency. After exposure to the 25 rem radiation, the image is almost entirely obliterated. This means, in my estimation, a dose as little as 5 rem would seriously undermine the transparency. It would look significantly fogged. It would be a very thin image.
If you look at the results, top quality duplicates, you can see that there appears to be no effect whatsoever. It never got to the stage where I heard, at least, that a film had been badly affected by temperature or the pressure differentiation or radiation.
I would expect to see on the transparencies evidence of small bright dots where a high velocity nuclear particle had impinged on that film. I have no evidence whatsoever that this has occurred. The good place to look for it is on the regions of the film which haven't been exposed in the camera, the black spaces, as it were, between the frames. We're protected on Earth by a nice thick atmosphere, and that combined with the magnetic field keep these ionizing particles away from us, on film of course. In space, you're not offered that protection. To prevent an ionizing particle, or very energetic particles that you get in space, from damaging the film, you would need a significant thickness of lead protecting that film.
So if the film exhibited no signs of radiation damage, then surely the camera itself must have been protected. Was the Hasselblad lunar surface camera shielded from radiation?
Well, the original ones were not protected at all. The ones they brought to the lunar surface were painted silver.
The temperature, of course, is very, very extreme on the lunar surface. In the sunlight, you could be easily as high as about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And, of course, in shadow areas and prolonged shadow, you could be in minus quantities.
As far as I know, they had no trouble with overheating of the film. And I think it worked for them, because I didn't hear any complaints about the film getting too warm. On the other hand, they might have had some trouble if the film got too cold, because then it cracked.
Would any of the problems cited have anything at all to do with Kodak's strange reticence to capitalize commercially on the film used for the lunar surface photography?
Although various films were tried by NASA, to all intents and purposes, it was only Kodak film which was used during Project Apollo. And I think, and one understands it, I think that the corporate management in Rochester was concerned about a monopoly situation. I think that was the reason, and it's sad in some ways because there was an enormous amount could be made of the fact that it was Kodak film being used.
Okay, let's see, how do I do this? F11? At 74. Click.
There's the pan. Okay.
Click. 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 Okay, Tony, do you want me to change the mags on the
EVA
16? It's about empty. Click. That's affirmative. Per second runs it through there.
Right, go ahead.
Okay, will do.
Should be mag R.
Okay. Click. Okay. Man, if I get this top of this and that picture, it's going to be a miracle. Click. Okay, Tony, during this pan, I've moved about 2 feet downslope, so I don't know if things are going to match up too well or not.
We'll make it work.
And if both the film and camera had problems with heat and cold, then how did the astronauts themselves stay cool? It was the job of the life support system, the PLIS, to regulate the body temperatures. How did that backpack actually keep an astronaut cool and likewise warm when they were working in the cold of the shadow areas?
Somehow they would have to radiate the heat away, and that's not an easy task because the rate that heat is radiated away goes up according to the fourth power of the temperature difference between the radiator and the surrounding medium. So you have to have a pretty hot radiator to radiate away a substantial amount of heat. It would be more likely that you would eject steam, because in taking the heat away from the astronaut, that heat would be used to heat water up and produce steam. So you should see venting of steam if they're using water for this purpose, rather than ice, actually.
We never once saw any ice crystals or indeed steam emanating from the vicinity of any astronaut, either spasmodically or on a regular basis. Not one piece of TV coverage demonstrates such an effect. Interestingly, many researchers, including Ralph Rene, also seriously doubt whether the PLIS had enough capacity for the job in the first place. In this part of the program, we've looked at the dangers of radiation and the serious problems to have been overcome on any journey to and from the moon. Clearly, in the 1960s, no one had the ability to deliver a guarantee against astronauts dying in space. This reason alone would have been sufficient motive for the falsification of what really happened during Apollo. We now come to one of NASA's biggest headaches: how to get the astronauts and their gear up and out into deep space in the first place. This segment of our program is the story of the Saturn V and those people who were behind the development of space rocket technology. Werner von Braun was to become one of the Nazis' chief rocket engineers, and together with Walter Dornberger of the German army and another older and more experienced rocket scientist, Hermann Oberth, they would develop the rockets deployed during the Second World War. But before that could happen, Hitler needed to be persuaded that the path-marked rocket development was the correct way to go and a worthwhile investment. All of which takes us back to 1927, when Werner von Braun was just starting out in his career, and Hermann Oberth was working on an extremely interesting project which surprisingly would become as relevant to the Apollo program as would the V2.
In the late 1920s, Hermann Oberth was invited to work on the German production Frau im Mond, Woman in the Moon. It was a Fritz Lang film, with a script credited to Lang's wife, Thea von Harbou. Frau im Mond was a silent movie with its plot based on manned flight to the moon. Oberth was responsible to Fritz Lang for the rocket design and flight details. It would appear that NASA has followed the principal elements of this virtual blueprint ever since. This design was for a multi-step rocket. As each stage runs out of fuel, it drops off into space and the next stage takes over, thrusting the craft further onwards. Oberth's design for the rocket comprised 3 steps. Apollo's launcher, the Saturn V, was a 3-stage rocket. It was constructed in a vertical position in a huge assembly shed. This is the house that Jack built over at the future Cape Kennedy. It's called the Vehicle Assembly Building and is very similar to that first German rocket shed. Inside, the Saturn V rocket was assembled vertically. Lang's rocket was driven out of the shed in a vertical position on a tractor-like transport to the launch location, just as NASA does today using its crawler vehicle. The Soviets, however, preferred to construct their rockets horizontally and then deliver them horizontally to the launch pad, as the Russians still do today. No doubt they recognized that moving a high centre of gravity rocket vertically was contrary to common sense. And contrary to some received opinion in the West, the Soviets have in fact always been the world's leaders in rocket development. With 21 firsts in space exploration, they had no need to present the world with rampant virility symbols for their journeys into space. As for NASA's Apollo launcher, the Saturn V, that rocket may not have been as great as it looked. To emphasize the moment before liftoff, Fritz Lang created the 10-9-8 countdown. It was one of the movie's most dramatic features. Lang had intended this countdown procedure merely to increase the dramatic tension at the launch. Lang said that NASA had incorporated another of his damn touches into its space dramas. Lang's actors were strapped to their couches, just as NASA did with Apollo. When the rocket motor had burned for a specified duration, we see first and second stage separation, as was the case with the Saturn V. In order to prevent the occupants from floating around the cabin in microgravity, they used the very practical solution of foot grips. Later, NASA was to stick everything to the walls with Velcro tape. And this attractive and exotic demonstration of the way that water globules will float in microgravity has also become an industry standard. Then the most memorable scene of all, the moon in the foreground and the distant Earth. A scene first visualized in the 1920s. And the lunar landscape as designed by Lang's artists, with the camera set up ready. This look, with its pointed rather than smooth mountains, was copied exactly by NASA space artists on the decals that depicted the individual Apollo lunar modules. As you can see, the Frauen Mon set matches the LEM 7 decal very closely. Remembering that LEM 7 was allocated to Apollo 13's Dark Moon trip, is it not significant that this decal is the only one of the Apollo LEM series which depicts a LEM actually sitting on a fake lunar surface?
So all of these NASA procedures had actually been foreseen by a movie director and his colleague in 1927, which is not altogether surprising when that movie director turns out to be the most influential filmmaker of his time and colleague of the most eminent rocket engineer of the 1920s. And since all of these individuals later turned up in America, Nazi scientists von Braun, Dornberger and Obert, who were employed by the American government, while Lang pursued his career in Hollywood, should we then be surprised that the same methodology appears to have re-emerged? Sometime between 1929 and 1933, Obert and von Braun produced a promotional movie designed to convince the German authorities of the viability of their rocket research program. They did this by intercutting film of their successful rocket tests together with actual scenes from Frau im Mond and presenting the finished product as total fact to Adolf Hitler. Greatly impressed, Hitler gave the order for their research to be funded virtually without restraints by bankrolling the development costs, which in turn were of course underwritten by the private financiers of the Third Reich. Hitler confirmed Walter Dornberger as the head of the German Army Weapons Department to oversee the project. Dornberger was to say to von Braun that they would all be in trouble if fiction did not soon become fact. A new site was soon secured for their expanding research, selected by von Braun on the advice of his mother. It had been a wild island used for duck shoots by the Prussian aristocracy, including von Braun's relations. The place was called Peenemünde. Dedicated assembly plant, fuel storage and rocket launch facilities were constructed at Peenemünde. The Nazis co-opted thousands of personnel to work on this new technological development. But all new technology has to undergo many trials and tribulations before it can be successful, and Peenemünde was the site of much experimentation before these rockets were perfected and a successful launch achieved. New pieces of technology were developed, including gyroscopic control. Brand new rocket engines were developed and perfected. Success then followed. Von Braun presented film footage of the latest launch to Hitler. Significantly, this successful launch had a depiction of Frau im Mond on the side of the rocket.
At the end of the film, he abruptly said, we think we have something pretty formidable here, and ordered immediately the highest priority to put the thing into quantity production.
Unfortunately for the team, in April 1943, during full production of the V-2, Hitler, following his dreams and instincts, halted all rocket development. Desperate to fulfill their dream, the two most influential people at Peenemünde, Dornberger and von Braun, asked Albert Speer to set up a meeting. And it was in July 1943 at the Wolfslair, Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters, that von Braun showed Hitler models of proposed underground production facilities to inspire him to resume production. Hitler bought von Braun's idea that he could rocket bomb his way to victory through the production of hundreds of thousands of V-2 and V-3 rockets. The team was so successful in their presentation that the very next day, Hitler awarded a professorship to von Braun in recognition of his achievements. Werner von Braun considered manned spaceflight the goal of his life. This launch vehicle would become key to the means by which mankind would attempt to reach out into space, but for the Third Reich it was just a transporter of explosive, 1 ton per rocket, that would travel a distance of 200 miles before delivering its lethal burden without warning onto its target. By August 1943, SS Sturmbannführer von Braun photographed here in uniform standing behind Himmler, had his underground facilities. Here in southern Bavaria, in the Mittelwerk, in appalling conditions, thousands of prisoners were used as slave labourers to manufacture the vast number of components required to fulfill the colossal production targets. These V2s were transported to the French and Belgian coasts where the Nazis had set up launch pads for the rocket bombing of England and elsewhere. In the latter part of the war, over 2,000 V2s rained down on London. A single V2 delivered a great deal of damage. Despite the fact that the Allies attempted to destroy Peenemünde twice, it was essentially spared, and this was of course vital if the Allies were to recover the scientists and their essential technology. Notice the similarity in overall concept between the original V2 engines and this, the much later Saturn V rocket motor. It's alleged that von Braun and his colleagues gave themselves up to the Americans, although the word rendezvous would appear to be nearer the mark. After various interrogations, or rather meetings, von Braun and his chosen band of rocketeers were escorted to America, where they were to become the backbone of the space program for several decades. Many other leading Nazi rocket engineers were assigned to the Soviet Union, and it is to misread history to imagine that the US gained the best of these engineers. Quite the contrary. The technicians, rockets and spare parts were divided up unequally between these two major powers. These operations, which had been planned for several years before the end of the war, were known as Overcast and Paperclip. How many British people knew or know even now that in the latter half of 1945, a prime cause of their recent misery, SS Sturmbannführer von Braun, had not only visited London, but had also been awarded an honorary fellowship by the British Interplanetary Society for his services to rocketry. The Soviets did not immediately repatriate their allotted portion of rocket engineers. They first worked with them on site in Germany and only subsequently moved everything, including personnel, back to the Soviet Union. Stalin fully supported the development of rocketry, and thanks to their methodology, the Soviets progressed faster in their understanding of the new rocket skills than did the United States. The Soviets milked their Germans dry of all knowledge, and by the 1950s the Soviet scientists knew as much, if not more, than their erstwhile teachers who were then repatriated to Germany. The Americans kept their rocket scientists permanently, played down their Nazi pasts, totally sanitized their records, and after some years granted them American citizenship. Research in the US progressed much more slowly than the development of rocket technology did in the Soviet Union.
Heading up the Soviet rocket program was a man in many ways very similar to von Braun, being a stickler for organization and a man of great vision. But where von Braun was merely an adequate engineer, and there were many men who were better than he, Sergei Korolev was a genius, the genius of all the rocket scientists. Korolev was responsible for the design of the rocket that launched the Sputnik, the world's first orbiting satellite. Unlike von Braun and Obert spacecraft, Korolev's concepts appear to have been inspired by nature, his powerful launch rockets emulated the splayed bases that support the giant trees of our planet. Despite being divided into several research and development departments, each with their own head of operations, it would be Sergei Korolev who would hold the entire Soviet space program together until his untimely and unexpected death on the operating table in 1966. This is Korolev's home in Moscow. Here is his desk. And in the hall wardrobe, his hat, just as he left it before going to hospital that fateful day. In America, things weren't going too well. The film record explains why there were so many uncertainties in the US military with their homegrown rockets. Back in the USSR, shortly after Sputnik 1, Korolev was launching Laika, the dog, into space. However, the Soviets were learning to be economical with the truth concerning their activities in space. It was publicly announced that Laika died painlessly when her oxygen supply ran out.
It was many years later before it was revealed that in fact Laika had died a painful death because the nose cone of the spacecraft ripped away as it reached Earth orbit, exposing the unprotected portion of Laika's cabin to the searing heat of the sun. But the further truth was that the nose cone had been designed to do exactly that. So, in the interest of learning how long a bioorganism could withstand such conditions, Laika had been knowingly destined for a painful death from the very start of the experiment, and the public were not to know what really happened until a comfortable time period had elapsed. If it has taken 30 years to get to the truth about a dog, how many more years will it take before the truth about the Apollo space program is allowed to seep into public consciousness concerning the fate of this planet's surrogate Apollo astronauts?
The go-ahead for manned flight had been given to Korolev at the end of 1960, and so he prepared his cosmonauts for the first manned orbit of Earth. At the climax of these preparations, the world was to see the images of a smiling young Yuri Gagarin boarding the bus that took him to the launch site, accompanied by his backup cosmonaut and staff from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. History in the making, for we were under the impression that these were news images from the Soviet Union, and we didn't question the fact. Why should we? The Soviet Union would enjoy beating the USA into space, and therefore we were absolutely certain that these events were and are recorded for posterity as they happened. Well, that turned out not to be the case.
Our research has found that few of the film images of Gagarin's space trip were shot at the time. It seems they were pre-filmed during several different sessions over an extended period. These images were then subsequently assembled and then edited to produce a final result, certainly not true news gathering. That would explain, for example, the continuity errors in the bus sequence. Gagarin is embraced by key individuals, including Korolev himself. But new information reveals that most of this footage was not shot on the day of the launch. Gallantly waving, Gagarin enters the elevator to ascend to the rocket launcher and the Vostok capsule. We then see Gagarin getting into the small capsule and sitting inside the sphere that was to be his home for this highly significant moment in history. The lighting, though, gives away the fact that this was all staged. Here we can see the cosmonaut sitting in his seat, but there are two shadows, one on each side of his head, indicating that lighting was used from two light sources placed either side of the camera. The top view shows that there was no lighting inside the capsule itself. Nor was there any room inside the small space for the camera and lighting rigs required. So how can there possibly be a view of Gagarin taken from the front rather than just from behind his head? We must emphasize that there was no space for another person, camera or lights inside this miniature capsule. This shot alone demonstrates that he was filmed from a cutaway setup, on another occasion, in another place, in a studio environment.
Details that have now come to light record that during the launch countdown, 2 awkward moments occurred. During the first of these, Korolev told the crew on the gantry that the hatch had not closed properly. This was news to them, as they had closed down all the bolts and no signals had activated to indicate any failure of procedure. Korolev insisted that the hatch be fully reopened and then rebolted, a task which added another 30 to 40 minutes to the countdown. Korolev also insisted that he alone would inform Gagarin of the delay. In fact, Korolev forbade the crew from speaking to the cosmonaut, who was supposedly listening to music inside the capsule. In so doing, he gave himself the opportunity to instruct Gagarin to leave, yes, leave the Vostok capsule. The second awkward moment occurred during this rebolting procedure, when the gantry began to swing away from the side of the rocket as if the countdown had not been halted. Obviously, the head of operations inside the launch bunker hadn't been apprised of the situation. About to fall off their lofty perch, the gantry crew hurriedly telephoned the launch bunker and asked them to return the gantry to the rocket's side, allowing them to complete their task.
So who was head of operations in the launch bunker?
Well, actually, it was Sergei Korolev, and he was totally aware of the timing of the countdown, since it was he who was responsible for the delay in the first place.
So why go to the trouble of creating this gantry incident?
We suggest it was a diversionary tactic, resulting in any observer taking their eye off the ball for a few vital minutes. This would ensure that the first publicised manned flight into orbit would not be compromised by a dead cosmonaut, and it would have served to cover the moment when Gagarin was removed from the capsule, and ultimately it would keep Korolev's research and development team ahead of their serious competition within the Soviet Union's internal space race. Was Gagarin removed and then replaced by a surrogate cosmonaut? Or did the Vostok capsule go aloft with only a tape machine aboard? A technique that the Soviets had already honed to perfection, and they had already acclimatized Western listeners to the idea that human voices emanated from probes officially classed as unmanned. But that's another story. This Vostok capsule landed on a designated site well away from the public gaze. In the meantime, Gagarin had apparently ejected himself from the capsule and landed well over a mile away. However, his method of landing was kept very quiet, creating confusion in the history books for years to come. The Soviets wanted to claim a flight record, and, according to aeronautical rules, not astronautical, ejecting or bailing out would disqualify the entire flight, so the pilot had to land within his craft.
Astronaut substitution would have meant that the number of people on the gantry platform would have increased or decreased between securing the hatch for the first time and the actual launch. Was this the case?
Oh, yes, it was. It took 5 people to seal the hatch and check the procedures first time around, but at the second resealing, only 3 people were employed on this task. There was motive, opportunity and time to accomplish the sleight-of-hand manoeuvre. And if such a tactic would ensure that the Soviet space program and their cosmonauts were kept alive, then it was worth the candle. Lord Bruce Gardyne was at that time a journalist with the London Financial Times, and until his death expressed grave doubts about the validity of the Gagarin flight. Throughout the spring of '61, he'd been in the Soviet Union and was in Moscow alive with rumours about this event, from April the 6th until his departure. On his way to the airport on April the 11th, he was informed by his very well-connected minder that, according to his sources, the flight had already taken place that morning. The source of this information had been none other than the chairman of the Soviet Committee of Sciences. Bruce Gardyne, travelling in Germany the following day, was then very surprised to hear the Gagarin flight being announced live over the East Berlin Airport tannoy system. Back in England, Jock Bruce Gardyne established that NASA initially denied all knowledge of the Gagarin flight on the 12th. This statement was later corrected by the White House. But were the Americans, in fact, fully aware that the Soviets did not launch a craft on that day, April the 12th? No one's denying that the Soviet Union put the first man in space, but was that man's name Yuri Gagarin?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The Apollo project was in part a Cold War exercise. It was about competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. Kennedy wanted people to get to the moon before the end of the 1960s in order to beat the Soviet Union. Or at least this was part of it. One part of it had this foreign policy objective. The Soviet Union, therefore, had a very strong incentive to discover if this was being faked, because that would have been a huge propaganda coup. And given the espionage capability and the propaganda machine of the Soviet Union as it then was, the idea that the faking of the Apollo project would have escaped their notice also seems completely implausible.
Is this business of faking news events new? No, not at all, as we saw earlier with the Lusitania disaster. Previous to that event in 1906, footage of the actual San Francisco earthquake was also faked. And this totally fabricated film material outsold pictures of the real thing, which only showed the aftermath of the earthquake.
If fakery is offered as the real thing, then where is the line drawn between falsifying a few images and organising a faked, safe version of the entire event?
But at least the Soviets did have the ability to launch a capsule into space. Back in the US, all kinds of things were going wrong with the genesis of the Saturn V rocket.
It would have taken an F-1 to get the Saturn V off if it were fully loaded. But knowing the records that were made of F-1 failures, and particularly something known as combustion instability, which was a problem right up to the end, rocket engines have a great failing. In other words, waves can be set up in the jet that cause a perturbation that rockets back and forth inside the engine and destroys it. And I personally saw rocket engines destroyed in that way. The B-1 engine would have been much more reliable because it was a lower thrust.
What observations does Bill Wood have concerning the Saturn V?
For the first 8 feet past the end of the exhaust nozzle of these F-1 engines, the exhaust is black. It's not glowing. It's a black exhaust. Just as if you were to have some type of a shroud around the end of the engine with maybe kerosene being injected into the exhaust, so that when the smaller engine fires down the center of this, it ingests air from the inside the engine compartment down through the nozzle and mixes it with this injected kerosene. And it taking about 8 feet for this heated kerosene to mix with air before it catches on fire behind the engine. And that seems to produce this 800-foot long fuel-rich flame that is flapping in the air behind the Saturn V. The flame behind the Saturn V doesn't look very much like the flames behind other rockets using the same propellants. There's no normal mode of operation that would cause an engine like that to produce this dark zone. To do that, it would have to be running so fuel-rich that it would be so inefficient that it couldn't possibly produce the performance that was claimed for it. It's possible that they never really did solve the combustion efficiency problem with the F-1 engine, and they decided that just for show purposes they would produce an engine that produced a giant flame, sort of like a huge flamethrower. And we all know that flamethrowers don't produce very much thrust.
As for their lunar lander, the Soviets designed a spherical module with 4 legs. The Americans also adopted a 4-legged lander, but finally agreed upon an angular, tent-like craft. Basically, this was an arrangement of 2 engines stacked one on top of the other, with additional functions assigned to the angular spaces of the vehicle. The lower half of this ungainly but appealing craft contained the descent engine, and after the moonwalks, this would become the launch pad for the upper part that contained the ascent engine. The pressurized crew cabin was arranged around the ascent engine housing, and the fuel tanks and equipment storage were located around that.
The LEM proposal was amazingly short. This was a 110-page document where Grumman proposed the entire LEM program, which is a $6.9 billion program. And that's an outrageously small document for anyone to submit and ask for $6.9 billion. There's no way that a reviewer could determine whether or not the contractor is going to accomplish anything worthwhile based on 110 pages of documentation for that size program. When I checked into 10 other programs of similar size, like the C-5A and large submarine orders or aircraft carrier orders, this type of thing, all of the proposals were between 5,000 pages and 86,000 pages, with an average of 38,000 pages. And yet we see this one standing there all by itself at 110 pages. And it appeared to me that this may have been a situation where they knew that if anyone checked, someone would say, well, in order to win this, you had to submit a proposal, right? So let me see the proposal. So they had to produce a proposal, but they didn't go to the trouble of producing one of decent length. A 110-page proposal is about appropriate for a $1.4 million program, which is 5,000 times smaller than the claimed LEM program. Now, you wouldn't need a very long proposal if you weren't really going to build a LEM that really had to work. If you were going to be building LEMs that ended up in museums or on displays, then you could probably do that for a few $1 million, and that might only require a 110-page proposal.
There were many problems for the engineers and astronauts during the development of the lunar module. On one occasion, Armstrong was nearly killed by the unpredictable trainer. After ejecting just in time, you can see Armstrong descending to safety. The LEM's rocket engines were designed to perform one-off vital tasks. The advantage of using the fuels chosen for the LEM, unlike any other alternatives, was that they could be stored without special cooling, and on firing should ignite instantly. When the descent or ascent engine was activated, instant combustion would have been a must, and the two engines had to perform without a single hitch.
The lunar lander descent engine, as well as the ascent engine, used a combination of hypergolic propellants, nitrogen tetroxide as the oxidizer, and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, or UDMH, as the fuel. Together they were known popularly as Aerozine 50. When they are mixed, they ignite spontaneously, and that's why they're called hypergolic propellants. After ignition, they produce a dark red opaque gas. We also have the Apollo footage showing, for example, the ascent engine lifting off and being followed up by a camera, and no exhaust gas showing. The exhaust jet coming out of the ascent or descent engine should be a tremendous cloud of dark red opaque gas which spreads out almost level with the tip of the rocket nozzle due to the vacuum on the moon. So that means it would have created an enormous cloud of gas, possibly even visible from Earth, but that's sort of a side issue. So that's what viewers should have seen when the ascent module took off. They should have seen a very large dark cloud.
All that is visible at the commencement of the LEM's ascent is not an exhaust, but only the bursting apart of the mylar covering. George Pinter worked for Grumman Aerospace on the LEM and was most actively involved at top level with the development of major LEM systems, especially the supercritical helium supply. His responsibilities involved not only the technical supervision of specialists, but also the overall management of the project. He was a recipient of an Apollo Achievement Award from NASA, especially in relation to his contribution to the Apollo 13 space rescue mission. George was so valuable to the creation of the LEM's engines that he was seconded to Rocketdyne for a brief period during their research into propulsion systems for the descent engine. George Pinter has stated that it was imperative that the astronauts were able to see when landing their LEM. So we have to ask, how did they accomplish that vital task when clouds of dense, opaque smoke and dust were surrounding the craft and obscuring the astronauts' view?
Remember how the Apollo 11 crew were seeing their way to the surface, only picking up a little dust, according to Armstrong. It is not widely known that the manoeuvring jets of the space shuttle also use hypergolics, and this exhaust is very clearly visible when these thrusters are fired. And as for not having any effect on the lunar surface, either melting it or blowing vast clouds of dust away, let alone generating a crater where they landed, well, here we can see that there is no disturbance whatsoever under the LEM, a fact, incidentally, that nearly all the crews felt obliged to draw our attention to.
It's just like Neil. I didn't dig any crater at all. Look at the descent engine. It didn't even dig a hole.
Prior to 1969, all NASA's artists depicted the LEM's exhaust smoke flaring out from beneath the LEM, whether it was red smoke or white smoke. But current, post-Apollo space film artists now depict simulations of the exhaust from the rocket engine coloured blue. Playing safe, surely. For George Pinter of Grumman, exhaust smoke would have to have accompanied the real landing and takeoff. But because the astronauts had to see to land, how could there possibly be any dense, opaque smoke of any colour? Remembering the 10,000 pounds of throttleable thrust burning at up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, not only should the LEM have generated a crater beneath the craft on landing, but for Apollo 11 at least, surely there should have been a trail of molten dust behind it as the craft travelled over the lunar surface on its overshoot to the final landing site. This is volcanic rock on Mount Etna, which was made molten by heat of only 1,000 degrees Celsius before solidifying.
What happened to all the dust that was kicked up by the engine? Why didn't it fill up the landing pads? Why didn't it cloud to the point where you couldn't see anything? They probably reasoned it this way, that if we create a crater, we're going to create more questions, more problems. Let's just say that the exhaust nozzle, because it was operating in a vacuum, was dispersed over a wide area, and that it really didn't have the strength to create a crater. Well, that's not true, because the main jet coming down still had to support 2,300 pounds of lunar lander in a lunar gravity, 1/6 of Earth. It had to support that. Obviously, the power had to be centralized, not spread out in a vacuum over, say, a 50-foot diameter circle. The jet from a rocket engine will move large boulders as though they were being shot out of a cannon.
Here is a more recent event that occurred in the mid-1990s with the DCX rocket.
The DCX dug up the prepared site so badly it dug a crater 2 feet deep while it was landing on compacted gypsum. And it tore that up, and big chunks of this gypsum broke loose and were pelting the outside of the craft, which was a lot beefier than the outside of the LEM. And finally, the last time they flew it, it did tip over because one of the 4 landing legs didn't come down. Of course, that would happen in 1995, but it would never happen in 6 Apollo missions, right, on the moon.
So, there are many reasons to question the Apollo imagery relating to the claimed landings and takeoffs from the lunar surface. If these moon landing images were faked, then how did we manage to acquire so many rocks? Core samples and lunar dust have been obtained by unmanned probes. The Soviets were particularly advanced in this technology, but there were supposedly many samples loaded onto LEMs and returned to Earth.
The claim is that the Apollo program collected hundreds of pounds of lunar rocks, something like 750 pounds, some large amount of lunar rocks in the 6 missions. And I think that only a few pounds were actually collected remotely, by ourselves and in a similar manner by the Russians, because we had an agreement before we went to the moon to trade lunar soil samples. We would trade soil from the sites that we visited, and they would trade samples from the sites that their robot craft visited and compare them. And then I think the vast majority of the hundreds of pounds of moon rocks that we claim to have are made here on Earth, and that's why they look so similar to Earth rocks. That's why they found that the composition is so similar. They can be irradiated or exposed to a vacuum or modified in certain minor ways so that they appear slightly different, and then they do an analysis and say, well, it's just like Earth rocks except for these few minor changes. And then they hypothesize that they were blasted by meteorites. Well, they can be blasted by meteorites artificially.
Paul Jacobs was a top investigator in San Francisco. I went to see him to get his help. I said, Paul, help me with my Apollo hoax project. He says, all right, I will. I'm flying to Washington next week. I'll go see the head of the U.S. Department of Geology. And he did. And he asked the geologist, did you examine the moon rocks? Did they really come from the moon? The geologist just laughed. Well, there's a sad ending to this story. Paul flew back from Washington. I met with him again in San Francisco, and he told me what he had determined, that the Apollo project was a hoax and that people at high levels were keeping it a secret. Unfortunately, Paul and his wife died of cancer within 90 days. Lee Galvani. He's been in touch with me for many, many years, and he says that he had almost convinced James Irwin to confess and clear his conscience of this terrible burden. And curiously and appropriately, James Irwin called me at my home here in SoCal and wanted me to call him back. But he was dead of a heart attack in 3 days.
Ignition and liftoff.
If the Saturn V was such a good launch vehicle, why was it dropped after the last Apollo mission to be replaced by the space shuttle? Why was a new launcher required when NASA supposedly had a tried and tested powerful rocket in the form of the Saturn V?
The shuttle weighs about 3/4 as much as the Saturn V, and it only puts about 1/6 as much weight into orbit, and it costs about 3 times as much as the Saturn V to launch. It was first flown 2 years behind schedule, and it's cost a lot more than the Saturn V to develop. So in almost every measure of rocket technology, the shuttle is greatly inferior to the claimed performance of the Saturn V.
Seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
If the Saturn V had worked, far and away the most logical thing to do with that hardware that was developed with billions and billions of dollars was to begin producing them, because then the development cost gets amortized over the cost of all of the produced vehicles, and use it to launch the shuttle. If they wanted to actually have an airplane that goes into orbit, they could have put a shuttle orbiter on top of the second stage of the Saturn V and flown the whole thing into orbit. The first stage would have dropped into the ocean like it normally does, and the second stage and the fully loaded shuttle orbiter would have made it into low Earth orbit. Now those second stages could have been assembled in orbit to form a space station. We could have had the first launch of the shuttle about 5 years sooner at a savings of about $20 billion, And by the time the shuttle was actually launched in 1981, we could have had the beginnings of a manned space station in orbit. If in fact their claimed performance was a hoax, then there's no reason to continue making any more of them. And that's why you might want to start all over and develop something from scratch that is actually going to work, even if it only puts up 1/6 as much payload and costs 3 times as much per launch.
It is a little-known fact outside the industry that the space shuttle is a vastly inefficient rocket. The allegedly recoverable boosters are more often lost at the bottom of the sea than they are recovered for reuse, which together with other issues minimises the claims for an economical recyclable spacecraft. One of the many reasons why replacement technology is being developed, for example the Lockheed Martin X-33 shuttle. Was there ever really a space race in the true sense of the word?
If we were racing the Russians to the moon, and if we beat them, why didn't they do it the next year, or 5 years later, or 10 years later, or even 25 years later? Why didn't they ever do it? And usually the response is, well, they got so discouraged because we beat them to the moon that they gave up. Well, if that were true, then why didn't we give up when they beat us with the first satellite into orbit, or the first man, or the first woman, or the first space station? Why did we keep struggling with them the whole time, and why the very first time we beat them in something major did they give up? And why did they give up so thoroughly that they never went at all?
Of course, we know at a very high level the Russians and the Americans have been in bed together for a long time. I mean, the Russian Revolution was financed by Wall Street. I mean, this is known.
Beginning October 18, Soviet cosmonauts Andrei Nikolaev and Vitaly Sevastyanov toured the U.S. and several NASA field centers. During that same month, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to study ways that American and Russian spaceships could meet and join in space. During his visit to Russia, President Nixon signed an agreement with Chairman Kosygin of the USSR to conduct an Earth orbital rendezvous and docking in 1975 between a U.S. and a Russian spacecraft. Engineers from both countries have already begun working out the details of the mission. American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts trained this year to prepare for a joint space mission in 1975. The two crews will meet and join their spacecraft while in orbit around the Earth. Beyond the rescue capability they will demonstrate, it is hoped the complex project will lead to future international cooperative programs.
They have sort of a tacit agreement that we won't blow the whistle on you if you won't blow the whistle on us. Simple. That's what I've often said on radio and television when they say, well, how come the Russians, if they knew that we didn't go to the moon, how come they didn't say anything? Well, it's better that they don't say anything.
It's highly likely that only a few individuals were privy to the whole plan. As with the Manhattan Project, which involved hundreds of thousands of people working across America on the development of the United States atomic bomb, only a relatively small group of scientists were aware of the actual agenda behind the work they were doing, and even fewer masterminds were coordinating the whole program. So in a similar way, this assault on space involved hundreds of thousands of people working towards, in their understanding, a race against the Soviets to reach the moon first.
No doubt when it was understood that it was going to be well nigh impossible to do the job safely with the available technology, only relatively few of the core teams would have been completely in on the alternative plan to fake the public record of the Apollo moon landings. This would become the cover for the surrogate program. Even fewer key individuals would have been in on the reasons behind the top-secret scheme to get out into space at all costs. And with that in mind, we propose that the Soviets and the Americans were at the highest level always working together on this planet's space program right from the start, and that the split of the Nazi rocket scientists into two teams, destined for America and the then Soviet Union, was part of a well-thought-out plan up and running before the end of World War II.
A key step in any space program would be the establishment of communication satellites in geosynchronous orbit around the Earth. This network of communications and spy satellites would also achieve the aim of the space program as set out by Lyndon Johnson. He said,
"Control of space means control of the world. From space, the Masters of Infinity would have the power to control the Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change the climates to frigid. There is something more important than the ultimate weapon, and that is the ultimate position, the position of total control over Earth. That lies somewhere in outer space.
It's entirely possible that there was always going to be a two-pronged programme for landing on the moon, one executed in secret and the other played out in public. However, both the American and Soviet teams, in the end, were at the mercy of radiation, the biggest showstopper in deep space exploration to this day.
Back in the 1960s, there is no doubt that those who were in control of space were controlling the information that encircled the planet. So how did they manage to overcome the technical problems inherent in pulling off the faking of the live TV coverage of Apollo?
I think probably the most logical way would be to beam signals to the moon and have an amplifier and repeater on the moon that would then amplify and repeat these signals and beam them back. That way anyone who had a proper antenna pointed at the moon could plainly see that they were getting signals from the moon. They just wouldn't know that those signals were bouncing back.
The Soviets had developed a very satisfactory roving vehicle, guided from Earth, called the Lunikod. Lunikod was landed successfully on the lunar surface and travelled over considerable distances. It had the capabilities of soil and rock sampling and was equipped with TV cameras and a laser reflector. These items had dust covers that could protect the lens and prisms respectively. The laser reflector was useful for receiving a laser beam from Earth in order to measure the precise Earth-Moon distance at any given moment in time.
One craft could have performed all of the functions that would simulate the lunar lander. It could land on the moon with its repeater, and this craft could also place a transmitting seismometer into the lunar soil that could continue to transmit back lunar quakes, which we received for quite some time. This same device could also pop out a laser reflector onto the moon's surface, and it could perform all of these functions. It could also have lowered a drill into the lunar soil and dug up lunar soil, and then the return craft, unmanned, could bring that soil back to Earth.
There really isn't a case to answer. The Apollo project had to have happened in order to produce this data, and if it hadn't happened, it would have been impossible to cover up for this length of time.
But people have been whistleblowing for many years now. In this programme, we've looked very carefully at evidence which clearly indicates that NASA hoaxed and faked the Apollo record. We've looked closely at many still photographs that are seen together on one continuous roll of film where there was no scope for retouching or the insertion of promotion pictures. And we have looked at the TV coverage as well. In addition to the attempted confession by James Irwin, there's a more recent statement from an Apollo insider. In September 1999, it was reported by journalist Graham Birdsall that at the first Pacific UFO conference in Hawaii, the astronaut Brian O'Leary, who worked alongside the likes of Armstrong and Aldrin for many years, commented,
"If some of the film was spoiled, it's remotely possible they may have shot some scenes in a studio environment to avoid embarrassment."
For an insider to consider this faking a possibility is quite remarkable. When that individual worked for NASA in the 1960s and specifically on the Apollo 11 mission during 67 and 68, this really is some statement. But the view that the still photographs have been faked, whereas the TV transmissions remain genuine just because they were live, is unacceptable. Both the TV and the still photographs were imaged in the same settings. One single contradictory example would be enough to demonstrate that there is a problem with the integrity of the material published by NASA. You've seen many such examples in this programme and much else besides. The lack of continuity between the stills and TV coverage of the same events, the whistleblowing inherent in the lighting of these images, the totally faked setups, the clues in the dialogue of the astronauts returning to mission control, and the serious problems associated with radiation and the technology. All these matters underline one simple fact. A representative of humanity may well have gone to the moon in 1969, but the images published by NASA of a manned lunar landing are not the true and accurate record of such an event. Bill K. Singh has been in contact with an electronics technician who's spoken out. He was part of the team at the Goldstone Tracking Station, California, during Apollo.
He strongly suspected that Apollo was being faked, that the information coming in was not coming from a genuine command capsule, it was coming from a satellite that was transmitting the information as though it were coming from the moon.
My integrity is insulted by these setups, these fakes. And I feel very strongly that it's time that these matters were brought to public light, were exposed, so that we can each and all of us understand as though we are human beings and not a sub-race governed by an elite who choose what we shall see and not see. This, as far as I'm concerned, is censorship of the very worst form.
But if, as NASA wishes to imply, if we were so successful at getting to the moon in the 1960s, and if we had already developed the principal technology to do so, and setting aside the purely scientific exploration of the moon, then why hasn't NASA practiced elements of their proposed manned Martian voyage out, around and on the moon? What was the prognosis for manned space travel beyond low Earth orbit after the days of Apollo? The RIDE report goes a long way to answering that question.
This report was written by a team that was chaired by Sally Ride, former shuttle astronaut, and they speculated in this report that if NASA were fully funded on a mission to send men back to the moon, that they could, if they spent billions of dollars a year starting in 1987, that they would be able to, they estimated they'd be able to first land men on the moon by the year 2010, which would mean 23 years to land men on the moon for the next time. And the question being, since it only supposedly took 8 years from Kennedy's announcement until Apollo 11, why would it take so much longer and cost so much more money to do it for the 7th time than it did to do it for the first 6 times?
However, this stated time period was to increase fourfold. In 1999, Douglas Cook, director of the Exploration Office at Houston's Johnson Space Center, said that his primary objective for future travel to the moon was to be able to test his hardware there, in readiness for a trip to Mars. Cook believes that humans will actually return to the moon within 100 years.
In the late 90s, the UN terminated weapons inspections in Iraq. In 1999, a BBC Panorama documentary demonstrated that the CIA had run an unauthorized eavesdropping operation against the Iraqis from UNSCOM's office in Baghdad, and that the British and the Americans hid behind the United Nations to run this spy operation from headquarters in Bahrain. It appears, though, that instead of just looking for weapons of mass destruction, they, UNSCOM, were, without the mandate of the United Nations, actually spying. Therefore, it was a United States, not a UN operation. So it would appear that the United States and UNSCOM claimed they were doing one thing, when in effect they were also doing something else. Now, this tactic is by no means new. Here, with the UNSCOM operation, are parallels with what we maintained happened during Project Apollo, 30 years previously.
From the sheer weight of evidence, the firm conclusion of this investigation has to be that in the case of Apollo, NASA stated that the agency was doing things one way when in fact a hidden surrogate program proceeded in a very different manner. The total costs of Project Apollo, together with the Soviet part of the program, were estimated to be at least $30 to $40 billion on each side. Now, given this cost, it's perhaps understandable that what we were shown was done so as to avoid the risk of these huge levels of funding not being made available in the first place, and much illusion, including the space race itself, had to be maintained to keep the funds flowing. But what this investment did bring was ownership of the true experiences encountered by any surrogate astronauts regarding the actual conditions on and around the moon. The rest of the world were never to know what motives really lay behind the first ever manned deep space program. Bennett and Percy, the authors of Dark Moon, propose that our planet's basic technology for space travel needs radical conceptual renewal, the development of a totally new form of space travel. And rather than sliding around on the surface of space, mankind needs to create a technology that enables us to travel through space within realistic time frames and without unduly endangering our astronauts. As they say, it's no longer acceptable to be economical with the truth in order to cover a hidden agenda. As ordinary citizens, we do not expect our space experts to know everything, nor should we hold today's people at NASA responsible for their predecessors' decisions, unless they wish to maintain the myth of Apollo in the face of the overwhelming new evidence. In that case, they will be as guilty as these first decision-makers. Moreover, incapable of fulfilling their desire to travel out into the solar system, these frustrated masters of infinity will then be bent on shoring up the edge of darkness, low Earth orbit with space stations and so-called Star Wars technology. During the 1986 Presidential Commission on the Shuttle Challenger disaster, the eminent physicist Richard Feynman found that NASA's analysis, claims and methodology were consistently incorrect. Feynman said,
NASA owes it to the citizens from whom it asks support to be frank, honest and informative. And so that these citizens can make the wisest decisions for the use of their limited resources for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations. For nature cannot be fooled.
If you have an unlimited budget, which is what the simulators had, you can do anything you want. You can create the most incredible vistas, people on Mars or Venus or planets of the nearest star. Money will buy anything, except happiness.